On the 31st of October, 2022, a small team of Egyptian and British archaeologists was working in a narrow, sun-blasted valley called Wadi Gabanat El Kurud, about 1.5 miles from the famous Valley of the Kings near Luxor. They weren't expecting anything remarkable that day. The team, led by a British archaeologist named Piers Litherland, had spent 3 years slowly clearing debris in an area they assumed contained the tombs of royal wives, since it sat close to the known burial sites of several queens married to Pharaoh Thutmose III. Then two of the excavation workers, Ashraf Omar Ali and Heraji Syed Ahmed, noticed something odd about the texture of the ground beneath their feet. A softness where there shouldn't have been one. They kept clearing carefully, and within hours, a staircase began to emerge, descending into the rock, leading toward a corridor no one had walked through in roughly 3,500 years. When Litherland finally reached the bottom and stepped inside, the first thing he saw stopped him completely. A ceiling painted deep blue, scattered with painted yellow stars, decorated with scenes from an ancient funerary text called the Amduat, a guide meant to walk a dead king safely through the 12 hours of night toward the sunrise of the afterlife. That specific combination, the star-painted ceiling and the Amduat text, was reserved exclusively for kings, not queens, not nobles, kings. Litherland later told the BBC that when he walked back out into the daylight, his wife was waiting for him outside, and the only thing he could do was burst into tears. It would take almost 3 more years of careful excavation and analysis before the team could say for certain exactly whose tomb they had found, because everything about its location had pointed toward the wrong answer. This is the story of Tomb C4, and if you don't recognize that name yet, you're about to understand why archaeologists around the world spent February of 2025 absolutely losing their minds over it. Let's back up and understand why this discovery mattered so much and why it took years to properly confirm. The pharaoh in question is Thutmose II, the 4th ruler of Egypt's 18th dynasty, who reigned for roughly 14 years, somewhere between 1493 and 1479 BCE. He is, by any honest account, one of the least documented and least dramatic pharaohs in Egyptian history, mostly remembered today for one specific reason. He was the husband and half-brother of Hatshepsut, one of the only women in Egyptian history to rule as a fully recognized king in her own right, rather than simply as a queen or regent. For over a century, ever since Howard Carter pulled back the wrappings on Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 and set off the single most famous archaeological discovery of the modern era, Egyptologists had quietly treated the missing tomb of Thutmose II as one of the field's great unsolved puzzles. Every other major pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, a golden age when Egypt reached the height of its wealth and territorial power, had a known, identified tomb, except this one. Multiple expeditions searched the Valley of the Kings and its surrounding side valleys across the 20th century and came up empty. By the early 2000s, many respected Egyptologists had quietly begun to suspect the tomb might be permanently lost to history, perhaps destroyed by flooding, or looted so thoroughly in antiquity that no trace remained to be found. So when Litherland's team broke through in October of 2022, the assumption wasn't excitement about Thutmose II at all. Given the tomb's specific location near the burial sites of several of Thutmose III's wives, and near where Hatshepsut herself had originally intended to be buried before she became king, the working theory was that they'd found the tomb of a royal wife, a genuinely important find, but not the field-shaking kind. It took nearly 3 years of meticulous excavation, sorting through debris and collapsed ceiling material, before the evidence needed to properly confirm ownership finally emerged. Fragments of small alabaster jars, shaped like ducks, the kind ancient Egyptians used to hold cosmetics, perfumes, and sacred oils for burial, turned up in the wreckage. Carved into their surfaces were inscriptions naming Thutmose II directly, referring to him explicitly as the deceased king, alongside inscriptions bearing the name of his wife, Hatshepsut. On the 18th of February 2025, Egypt's Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities made it official. This was, in the words of the ministry's Secretary General Mohammed Khalid, one of the most important archaeological discoveries in recent years, and by most accounts, the first tomb of a ruling pharaoh from Egypt's New Kingdom found near the Valley of the Kings since Carter's discovery over 100 years earlier. But here's where the story gets genuinely strange, because the tomb Litherland's team found was disappointing in one very specific, very telling way. It was almost empty. Archaeological evidence pointed to a catastrophic flood that struck the tomb shortly after Thutmose II's burial, and the water damage had apparently been severe enough that ancient priests made the decision to relocate the pharaoh's mummy and most of his grave goods to a safer location entirely, sometime during Egypt's Third Intermediate Period. That relocated mummy had actually already been found back in 1881, buried inside a mass cache of royal remains at a site called Deir el-Bahari, alongside the bodies of other relocated pharaohs, including Thutmose I, Seti I, and Rameses II. For nearly a century and a half, museums and textbooks confidently labeled that particular mummy as Thutmose II. And then Litherland's team, digging through the actual data more carefully after their 2022 discovery, noticed something deeply uncomfortable. The mummy, long attributed to Thutmose II, belonged to a man who died somewhere around 30 years of age. Historical evidence suggests Thutmose II likely died considerably younger than that, possibly still in his late teens. If that's accurate, the mummy sitting in Cairo's National Museum of Egyptian Civilization, the one labeled with his name in exhibition cases for generations, might not actually be him at all, which raises a question that should genuinely unsettle you if you think about it for more than a few seconds. If that mummy isn't Thutmose II, then where is he? Litherland now believes there may be a second, still undiscovered tomb somewhere nearby, one that was never flooded, one that may still contain the original undisturbed burial, sarcophagus, canopic jars, and all. As of this recording, that second tomb, if it exists at all, has not been found. Let that sink in for a second. In 2025, with satellites orbiting the planet, ground-penetrating radar, drone photography, and over 2 centuries of continuous archaeological excavation behind us, we still cannot say with total confidence where the actual body of a pharaoh who ruled one of history's greatest empires is currently resting. And this isn't some obscure minor ruler either. This is the husband of Hatshepsut, one of the most consequential figures in the entire New Kingdom. If a story like this genuinely fascinates you the way it fascinates me, go ahead and hit that like button right now. Because we're about to zoom out from one tomb to the much bigger, much older question sitting underneath the entire Giza plateau. And honestly, this is where things get a lot more contested. Here's a question that sounds simple on the surface, but has divided serious researchers for over 30 years. How old is the Great Sphinx of Giza, actually? The textbook answer, the one taught in virtually every university Egyptology program on Earth, is straightforward. The Sphinx was carved directly out of the Giza Plateau's bedrock during the reign of Pharaoh Khafre, roughly 2500 BCE, as part of the same construction project that produced his pyramid and its surrounding temple complex. The stylistic details support this. The layout fits neatly into the broader geometry of the Giza site. Blocks of limestone quarried directly from the Sphinx enclosure appear to have been reused in nearby temple walls, suggesting the whole complex went up together as one coordinated project, under one ruler. But in 1990, a geologist from Boston University named Robert Schoch traveled to Giza at the invitation of an author named John Anthony West, who had spent years arguing that the Sphinx was far older than mainstream Egyptology claimed. Schoch examined the deep, undulating vertical fissures carved into the limestone walls surrounding the Sphinx enclosure, the kind of weathering pattern you typically see on rock faces exposed to centuries of heavy, direct rainfall. And his professional geological opinion, delivered without hesitation, was that these erosion patterns looked nothing like what wind and blowing sand typically produce over time in an arid desert climate. They looked like water damage. Specifically, the kind of prolonged, heavy precipitation that simply hasn't fallen on the Giza Plateau in that quantity since the end of what climatologists call the African humid period, a wetter climate phase across North Africa that ended somewhere between 7,000 and 5,000 BCE. If Schoch was right, and the erosion truly required that kind of sustained rainfall to form, then the core body of the Sphinx would need to be at least 2,000 years older than Khafre's reign, and quite possibly far older still, pushing its origin back into a period before Egypt's earliest known dynasties existed at all. West took that geological finding and ran even further with it, connecting it to older, more speculative ideas about a lost, highly advanced prehistoric civilization, one that supposedly built the Sphinx thousands of years before the Egypt we actually have written records for, and was subsequently wiped out or forgotten, its achievements later claimed or repurposed by the dynastic Egyptians who came after. Now, to be completely fair to the researchers pushing back on this, and there are a great many of them, this idea runs into serious, specific problems the moment other geologists and archaeologists examine the same evidence. Mark Lanner, one of the most respected Egyptologists, specializing specifically in the Giza Plateau, directly challenged Schoch's methodology, arguing that the weathering pattern Schoch identified as deep water erosion is actually better explained by softer limestone layers eroding unevenly and irregularly over thousands of years of ordinary desert weathering, wind, and occasional flash flooding, a pattern that doesn't require anything close to the sustained tropical rainfall Schoch's theory demands. Other geologists point out that the specific layout of the Sphinx enclosure fits precisely into the broader architectural plan of Khafre's pyramid complex, in a way that would require an enormous coincidence if the Sphinx had actually been carved thousands of years earlier by a completely different, otherwise archaeologically invisible civilization. Yeah, and there's a deeper problem that alternative theories about a lost pre-dynastic civilization have never adequately solved. If an advanced society existed thousands of years before Egypt's earliest known dynasties, sophisticated enough to carve a monument on the scale of the Sphinx, where exactly is everything else they built? Their pottery, their tools, their settlements, their written language, their burial sites. Egyptologists have spent 2 centuries excavating the Nile Valley and its surrounding deserts with increasingly sophisticated tools, and the archaeological record shows a fairly clear, gradual progression from small pre-dynastic farming communities toward the centralized, literate monument-building civilization that eventually produced the pyramids and the Sphinx. There's no missing layer of advanced infrastructure sitting underneath it, no orphaned toolkit or abandoned city from some vanished predecessor culture, which is precisely why, more than 30 years after Schock first published his findings, the overwhelming majority of professional archaeologists and Egyptologists still classify the Sphinx water erosion hypothesis as a fringe position rather than an accepted alternative timeline. It hasn't been definitively mathematically disproven in a way that ends the conversation forever. But it also hasn't found the kind of independent, corroborating physical evidence, additional structures, additional artifacts, additional sites that would be needed to actually overturn more than a century of converging archaeological data. So where does that leave us? Probably in the least satisfying place a good mystery can leave you. The honest, responsible answer is that Khafre almost certainly commissioned the Sphinx as part of his pyramid complex around 2500 BCE, and the alternative water erosion theory, while raised by a credentialed geologist and taken seriously enough to be debated at professional academic conferences, has not held up well against the broader archaeological picture. But almost certainly is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and it's worth remembering that mainstream Egyptology itself has been repeatedly, genuinely surprised before. For decades, respected Egyptologists confidently declared that the Valley of the Kings had nothing left to find, right up until Howard Carter proved every single one of them wrong in 1922. And barely 3 years ago, in that same valley's shadow, a team of archaeologists spent 3 years second-guessing their own discovery because the location simply didn't match where a pharaoh's tomb was supposed to be. If the location of an entire pharaoh's tomb can be wrong for over 100 years, right in the most heavily studied patch of desert on the planet, it's at least worth sitting with a little humility about how confidently we can speak about anything carved into that same plateau 4,500 years ago. There's something almost poetic sitting underneath both of these stories, the Sphinx debate and the tomb of Thutmose II, and it's this. Egypt has been continuously excavated by professional archaeologists for roughly 200 years now, longer than the entire history of the United States as a country, and we are still, right now in 2026, actively unsure of 2 very basic facts. Whether one of the most photographed monuments on Earth was carved in 2500 BCE or thousands of years earlier, and where the actual physical remains of a pharaoh married to one of history's most famous female rulers are currently resting, not in some inaccessible jungle, not at the bottom of an unexplored ocean trench, in a valley that has had archaeologists walking through it more or less continuously for 2 centuries. Litherland's team is still out there right now, working through the western wadis near Luxor, following whatever clues might lead them toward a second, possibly untouched, possibly intact tomb of Thutmose II. The kind of find that, if it happens, would likely rival Tutankhamun's tomb for sheer historical significance, since unlike Tutankhamun's chamber, this one would belong to an adult pharaoh from one of Egypt's most powerful and well-documented dynasties. If they find it, and there's absolutely no guarantee they will, it would probably be the single biggest Egyptological discovery of this entire generation. So if you take one thing away from this video, let it be this. We like to imagine that we've basically finished exploring our own planet's past, that the great discoveries all happened 100 years ago, carried out by men in pith helmets with torches and courage. But the truth is messier, and honestly, a lot more exciting than that. In 2022, in one of the most studied valleys on Earth, 2 workmen felt a slight softness in the ground beneath their sandals, and it led to the first pharaoh's tomb found in over a century. Somewhere out there, possibly less than a mile away from where that discovery happened, there may be an intact, untouched, 3,500-year-old royal burial, sitting quietly in the dark, waiting for someone to notice. The ground feels just a little bit soft in the wrong place. If this kind of story genuinely gets you thinking, do me a favor and subscribe, because we track discoveries like this the moment they break. And if a second tomb of Thutmose II ever gets confirmed, this channel is going to be the first place you hear the full story. Share this with anyone you know who still thinks Egypt has nothing left to discover, and I'll see you in the next one.